The day Eliza Rowan lost everything, she was standing in the middle of a courthouse hallway wearing her dead father's coat. It was 2 sizes too big. She hadn't noticed until that moment. The lawyer, a thick-necked man named Gerald Pruitt, who smelled like pipe tobacco and old money, didn't even look up from his papers when he told her. He just slid a document across the table like he was passing salt at dinner. The property transfers to the bank effective Friday. You have until Thursday to remove your personal belongings. That was it. No pause, no apology, not even the basic human decency of eye contact. Eliza stared at the paper. Her father's signature was at the bottom, shaky, slanted, the handwriting of a man who had already been dying when he signed it. She hadn't known about the loan. He hadn't told her. Maybe he'd been too proud. Maybe he'd thought he had more time. Maybe he simply couldn't bring himself to say the words out loud. She would never know now. "Miss Rowan." Pruitt finally looked up. His expression wasn't cruel exactly. It was worse than cruel. It was bored. "Do you understand what I've explained?" "I understand." "Good." He gathered his papers. "You might want to look into domestic work. There's decent pay in housekeeping for the right families. Given your situation," he said situation the way people say problem when they don't want to be bothered with details. Eliza folded this document, tucked it inside her father's coat, and walked out of that courthouse into the January cold without another word. She didn't cry until she reached the edge of town, where no one could see her. If that were you, standing in a coat too big for your body, holding papers that erased the only home you'd ever known, while a man who didn't know your name told you what your life was worth, what would you do? Where would you go? Before we go any further, if you're new here, take a moment and subscribe to this channel. Stories like this one don't come along every week, and I'd hate for you to miss what happens next. Hit that like button and drop a comment below telling me what city or country you're watching from. I read every single one, and I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to Montana, 1887, and find out what happened to Eliza Rowan. She had exactly $4.60, a canvas bag containing 2 dresses and her mother's sewing kit, and a name written on a scrap of paper that a woman at the dry goods store had pressed into her hand with the quiet urgency of someone passing a secret. Silas Hawthorne. Hawthorne Ranch. 14 miles northeast. Needs a housekeeper. Pays fair. 2 boys, no wife. Eliza had stood on the frozen road looking at that scrap of paper for a long time. She wasn't desperate. She told herself that very firmly. Desperation was for people who had already run out of choices, and she still had, she counted them carefully, the $4.60 and the sewing kit and the 2 dresses. That was something. That was a start of something. She hired a boy with a wagon for 50 cents to take her northeast. She did not look back at the town as they left. The Hawthorne Ranch appeared out of the gray winter afternoon like something that had been dropped there and forgotten. The main house was 2 stories, built from timber that had weathered to the color of old bone. A barn stood to the left, larger than the house, which told you something about the man who'd built it. A woodpile stretched along the east wall, stacked with the particular obsessive precision of someone who spent a great deal of time alone and needed something in their life to be orderly. Smoke came from the chimney. That was a good sign, she decided. What was not a good sign was the man standing on the porch watching her wagon approach, with the expression of someone who had just discovered an unexpected expense. Silas Hawthorne was not what she'd pictured when she'd read the word rancher on that scrap of paper. She had pictured someone older, rounder, with the weathered complacency of a man settled into his life. Silas Hawthorne was none of those things. He was tall, lean, in the way that comes from actual physical labor rather than intentional effort, with dark hair going silver at the temples, and a jaw that looked like it had been set in a permanent argument with something. He might have been handsome once, in a sharper era of his life. Now he just looked tired in a way that had become structural. He watched her climb down from the wagon without moving to help. Not rudeness, she would realize later, just the automatic self-sufficiency of a man who had spent years in a place where there was no one to help with anything. "Miss Rowan?" His voice was lower than she expected. "Mr. Hawthorne." She extended her hand. He shook it, firm, brief, businesslike. His palm was calloused in the specific places that came from rope work. "You're younger than I expected," he said. "You're more skeptical than I expected.
Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile, more like the ghost of one that had given up before it arrived. "Come inside," he said. "I'll explain the terms." The inside of the house hit her like a physical thing, not the cold, which was everywhere, but the particular quality of the silence. It was a house that had forgotten how to be lived in. The furniture was there, solid and functional, but nothing was quite in the right place. A chair sat at an odd angle that no one had bothered to correct. A curtain hung slightly wrong on one side. There were dishes stacked clean but not put away, sitting on the counter like someone had done half the job and then forgotten what came next. And underneath it all, trying hard to disappear, were two boys. The older one was maybe 11, sitting at the kitchen table pretending to read a book he was clearly not reading. He had his father's jaw and his father's wariness, and he looked at Eliza the way a person looks at weather, calculating whether it's going to cause problems. The younger one was 7 or 8, hiding so badly behind the older boy's chair that his sock feet were still visible. "My sons," Silas said, "Thomas and Henry." Thomas gave her a curt nod that was painfully adult. Henry said nothing, but he moved his feet so they were slightly less visible. "Gentlemen," Eliza said, in the tone she had learned from her own mother, the one that was warm but not saccharine, that acknowledged them as people rather than furniture. "I'll try not to rearrange too many things." Thomas's eyes narrowed slightly. She could see him deciding whether that was a joke. Henry took one small step out from behind the chair. Silas walked her through the house with the efficiency of a man who had explained these things before and was tired of explaining them. The meals needed to be on the table by 6. The boys needed their clothes mended and their lunches packed for school. The floors swept 3 times a week minimum because the mud came in no matter what you did. He said all of this without looking at her, moving through rooms and pointing at things as if conducting an inspection rather than a conversation. "Previous arrangements," he said when they reached the small room off the kitchen that would be hers, "didn't last. I'll be straightforward with you about that." "How many previous arrangements?" He paused. 3. "In how long?" Another pause. 8 months. She looked at him. He looked at the wall just past her shoulder. "Why did they leave?" she asked. "The work is hard." "I grew up on a farm, Mr. Hawthorne. I know what hard work looks like." The isolation bothered them. "It's 14 miles to town." "I just traveled 14 miles to get here. I'm still standing." Something shifted in his expression. Not softened, Silas Hawthorne didn't appear to be a man who softened easily, but recalibrated, the way you recalibrate when something behaves differently than you predicted. "The boys," he said carefully, "are not easy." It was the first thing he'd said that sounded genuinely true. "I'm not particularly easy myself," Eliza said. "We'll manage." He named a wage. It was fair, more than fair actually, which she noted. A man who paid fairly was either wealthy enough not to care or principled enough to care anyway. With Silas Hawthorne, she suspected the latter. She accepted. He shook her hand again, same grip, same brevity. "Meals at 6, he said, and went back outside. She stood in the small room that was now hers. Bare walls, single window, a bed with a quilt that someone had made carefully a long time ago, and listened to the silence of the house settle around her. She was 29 years old, $4.10 to her name, and she was starting over in a place that smelled like wood smoke and old grief. It wasn't what she'd planned. Then again, nothing lately had been what she'd planned. The first week was a series of small disasters she refused to call disasters. The bread she baked on Tuesday came out denser than she intended because the oven ran hotter than she was used to. She served it anyway. Thomas ate it with the stoic neutrality of a boy determined not to give anything away. Henry ate 3 pieces, which she decided to count as a victory. The second morning, she woke at 5 to start breakfast and found Silas already in the kitchen, sitting at the table in the dim pre-dawn with a cup of cold coffee and a ledger open in front of him. He looked up when she came in. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "I can make fresh coffee," she said. "You don't have to." "I'm making it anyway." He watched her move to the stove without comment. She could feel him watching, not in an uncomfortable way, more in the way of someone recalculating something, running a new set of numbers. "The ledger," she said, because the silence was the kind that wanted filling. "Ranch accounts?" "Land payments due in March. Trying to figure out the shortfall."
She didn't ask how large the shortfall was. That wasn't her business. But she filed the information away with the quiet practicality of someone who had spent her whole life learning to read the shape of other people's financial anxiety. "I won't waste anything," she said. "In the kitchen. You don't have to worry about that." He looked at her then. Really looked at her. Not past her or through her. "I wasn't worried about that." "Good," she said, and poured his coffee. He went back to the ledger. She started breakfast. And somehow, in that dim kitchen with the wind doing its usual business outside, the morning felt almost like something that could become ordinary. The first real test came on a Thursday. Thomas came home from school with a bruised cheek and both fists clenched so hard his knuckles had gone white. He walked straight through the kitchen without looking at her, straight up the stairs, and the sound of his bedroom door closing was not quite a slam, but close enough to feel like one. Henry drifted in behind him, smaller and slower, with the wide eyes of a child processing something he didn't have words for yet. "What happened?" Eliza asked. Henry chewed his lip. "Jimmy Calloway said something about Mama." She waited. "At lunch. In front of everybody." Henry's voice was very small. "Tom didn't cry or anything. He just hit him." Eliza looked at the ceiling, in the direction of the closed door above. Every instinct she had said to go up there. To knock, to check, to say something useful. But she had watched enough well-meaning adults in her own childhood make the mistake of arriving too early, before a person had finished being angry, before the anger had turned into something they could actually talk about. She finished making dinner instead. Silas came in at 6, read the room in about 4 seconds the way a man does when he's had years of practice at coming home to something he didn't expect, and looked at Eliza with a question in his eyes. She tilted her head slightly toward the stairs. He went up. She heard his footsteps, then the sound of his knuckles on the door, then low voices she couldn't make out. 15 minutes later, he came back down. He sat at the table. He didn't say anything for a moment, then, "He's not hungry." "I'll leave a plate." Silas rubbed one hand along his jaw. "The Calloway boy's been saying things all year. He won't talk about Eleanor with me. Won't talk about her at all." A pause. "His mother," he added unnecessarily. "I know," Eliza said. He looked at her. "Boys don't stop missing their mothers," she said. "They just stop mentioning it because they think it makes the adults uncomfortable." He was quiet for a long time after that. Henry ate 2 servings of stew and asked Eliza if he could have the heel of the bread loaf, which was apparently his preferred piece, a fact she carefully memorized. After dinner, she carried a plate upstairs and set it outside Thomas's door without knocking, just left it there on the floor with a small folded note. "You don't have to eat it, but it'll be here if you want it." She went back downstairs. An hour later, the plate was empty outside the door. She said nothing about it to anyone. What? The second week brought a storm that came in hard from the northwest and decided to stay. The kind of storm that turns practical problems into genuinely dangerous ones. Silas rode out at dawn to check the cattle and came back at midday with the information that 3 fence sections had come down in the lower field and the animals were drifting. He said this to no one in particular, in the tone of a man recalculating problems he'd already been calculating, and went back outside to get more rope. Eliza pulled on her coat. "What are you doing?" he said, when he turned and found her behind him. "You'll need someone to hold the posts while you drive them." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." She was already heading toward the barn. "Where are the gloves?" He stared at her for a beat, that recalculating look again, and then pointed without further argument. They worked in the storm for 3 hours. The wind was the particular kind that gets inside your clothes no matter what you do, and the frozen ground pushed back against every post with the stubbornness of something that had made up its mind. Silas drove. Eliza held. They didn't talk much because the wind made talking impractical, but they developed quickly the wordless coordination of people doing a physical job together. The slight shift of weight, the timed grip, the instinctive adjustment when something wasn't working. When the last post was set, they stood back and looked at the repaired fence in the flat gray light of the afternoon. "Thank you," he said. "Don't mention it." He looked at her then with the particular expression of a man who has spent a long time being alone and isn't sure what to do with the fact that someone just made things easier. She was already walking back toward the house. There was a warmth in her chest she refused to examine too closely. That was the thing about starting over. You had to be very careful which feelings you decided to pick up and carry, and which ones you left lying in the snow. Thomas found her in the kitchen an hour later, when she was standing at the stove with her hair still damp from the storm, and he stopped in the doorway and looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. "You fixed the south fence?" he said. "Your father fixed it. I just held things." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "The last woman who came here. She didn't go outside during storms. She said it wasn't part of the arrangement." Eliza kept her eyes on the pot. "Well, things needed fixing." Another pause, longer this time. "Henry thinks you're going to stay," Thomas said. His voice was careful, deliberate, the voice of a boy who had practiced being careful. "I intend to." They all intended to. She turned and looked at him then, because he deserved a direct answer and not a reassuring one. "I know. And I can't promise you that nothing will ever change, because that's not a promise any person can honestly make. What I can tell you is that I have nowhere else to go and no particular interest in starting over somewhere new. This feels like the most honest thing I can say." Thomas stared at her. She turned back to the stove. After a moment, she heard him pull out a chair and sit down at the kitchen table. Not to do homework, not to wait for something, but just to be in the room. She counted that as the second real victory. The empty plate outside Thomas's door became a quiet ritual neither of them acknowledged out loud. It started that first Thursday after the fight with Jimmy Calloway, but it didn't stop there. Eliza noticed that Thomas rarely came to dinner when his father was late from the fields. Not out of stubbornness exactly, more like he didn't know how to sit at a table and make conversation when the weight of the day was still sitting on everyone's shoulders. So she started leaving things. Not always a full plate, sometimes just a biscuit wrapped in cloth, or a small cup of apple preserves with a spoon tucked beside it. Never with a note after that first time. Just the food, set quietly outside the door, taken without comment. She didn't know if Silas noticed. She suspected he did. He noticed most things, just rarely said anything about them. What she didn't expect was that Thomas would start showing up in the kitchen on his own. Not dramatically, not with any announcement. He would simply appear in the doorway around the time she was finishing the dinner dishes, lean against the frame with his arms crossed like he was only passing through, and then somehow still be there 20 minutes later, talking about something that had happened at school in the flat, careful tone of a boy who had taught himself to report facts without revealing how much they mattered to him. She listened. She didn't offer advice unless he asked, which he never did. She kept washing dishes or mending whatever needed mending, and she let him talk to the side of her head, which seemed to be easier than talking to her face. It was during one of these kitchen evenings, about 3 weeks into her time at the ranch, that Thomas said something that stopped her hands mid-motion. "Dad used to talk more. Before." Eliza set down the bowl she was drying. "Before your mother?" "Yeah." I was quiet for a moment. He wasn't like this. He used to tell these long, stupid stories about nothing, about things that happened to him when he was young. Henry doesn't remember. He was too little. But I do." He picked at a loose thread on his sleeve. "Now he just works and comes in and works some more." Eliza thought about the man she'd seen at the kitchen table before dawn with a cold cup of coffee and a ledger full of numbers that didn't add up. The man who had driven fence posts in a blizzard without asking for help and then looked almost startled when help showed up anyway. "Grief changes people," she said. "Not as comfort, just as fact." "Is it supposed to change them that much?" She considered lying to him. The kind lie would have been, "No, not forever. He'll come back to himself." She didn't know if that was true, and Thomas was old enough to know when he was being managed. "I don't know," she said. "I lost my father 3 months ago. I'm still figuring out what it's changed in me." Thomas looked at her with something new in his expression. Not quite sympathy, because he was too proud for that, but recognition. The look of someone who has realized they are not, in fact, the only person carrying something heavy. "I didn't know that," he said. "You didn't ask." A beat of silence. "I'm asking now," he said. So she told him a little. Not everything. She wasn't going to hand an 11-year-old boy the full weight of her situation. But enough. About her father's farm. About the lawyer with his papers and his bored expression. About standing in a coat that didn't fit and making a decision in a courthouse hallway that had brought her here. Thomas listened the way she listened to him, without advice, without fixing anything. When she finished, he just nodded slowly. "So you didn't really have anywhere else to go," he said. Not cruelty, just the blunt arithmetic of a boy sorting information. "Not really. But you stayed anyway." "I'm still here." He thought about that for a moment. The last woman, Mrs. Prentice, she said she'd stay too. She said it the first week. She left in the middle of the night 3 months later and didn't even wake anyone up to say goodbye. Eliza felt something tighten in her chest. Not for herself. For the boy standing in front of her who had learned to calibrate his trust based on how many women had disappeared from this house in the dark. "I won't do that," she said. "That's what she said too." "I know." She picked the bowl back up and finished drying it. "I'm not asking you to believe me, Thomas. I'm just telling you what's true right now. Tonight I'm here. Tomorrow I'll be here. That's the only promise I can honestly make." He looked at her for a long moment, jaw set, eyes doing that same calculation his father's eyes did, assessing, measuring, running the numbers. Then he pushed off the doorframe and headed toward the stairs. "Henry likes when you put butter on the bread first," he said, without turning around. "Before you slice it. He won't say so because he doesn't want to be a bother, but he thinks it's better that way." He was gone up the stairs before she could respond. She stood in the kitchen holding a dry bowl, and she thought, there it is. That's the first real thing he's given me. She started buttering the bread before slicing it the very next morning. Henry's face, when he bit into his breakfast piece, was the involuntary expression of someone tasting exactly what they wanted. He didn't say anything either, but he looked up at her just for a second, and she saw it. That was the third victory. She was keeping count now, whether she meant to or not. Silas noticed the bread. She saw him notice, a slight pause, a glance at Henry, then a glance at her. He didn't say anything. He picked up his coffee and went back to looking at something through the window that apparently needed looking at. But that evening, when he came in from the fields, he stopped in the kitchen doorway and said, without preamble, "I'm going into town on Saturday. Supply run. If you need anything, write it down." It was practical. Entirely practical. It was also the first time he had offered to get her something without her having to think of a reason to ask. She wrote him a list. Flour, salt, dried beans, lamp oil, and she hesitated, then wrote it anyway. A ball of red yarn. He looked at the list. He looked at the last item. "Henry's mittens are worn through," she said. "The left one's got a hole big enough to be useless." He folded the list and put it in his coat pocket without a word. He came back with everything on it, including the yarn, which he set on the kitchen counter with the rest of the supplies without drawing any attention to it. She made Henry new mittens by Tuesday. Red, because it was the yarn she had, but also because red was easy to spot if a 7-year-old dropped one in the snow, which seemed likely. Henry put them on immediately and wore them inside for the rest of the evening, which she was fairly certain was not about warmth. She caught Silas watching his younger son's red-mittened hands over dinner with an expression that was complicated in ways she didn't try to interpret. Some things in this house were not hers to understand yet, and she was wise enough to know the difference. What she did understand was the shortfall in the ledger. She hadn't meant to look closely. She'd been cleaning the desk in the main room, actual cleaning, the kind that involves moving things rather than dusting around them. And the ledger had been open, and numbers had a way of speaking to her even when she wasn't trying to listen. Her father had kept the farm accounts himself, but she'd balanced them every year since she was 15, sitting at a kitchen table very much like this one, adding columns until they came out right. The Hawthorne numbers were not coming out right. The land payment due in March was larger than she'd assumed. The cattle prices from the fall sale had come in lower than projected, which she gathered from a scrawled note in the margin. And there were 3 smaller debts listed below the main one, each with dates that were already passed. She closed the ledger and put it back exactly where she'd found it. She spent the next 4 days being very observant about where food was being wasted in the kitchen and started keeping a running list of adjustments. Smaller portions of the expensive cuts, stretching the beans further, making the bread do double duty as both dinner and breakfast the next morning. Not starvation economics, just careful ones. She also started getting up 20 minutes earlier each morning to start the stove before Silas came downstairs, so the kitchen was already warm when he arrived. It didn't save money, but it meant he came into a warm room instead of a cold one, and that seemed like a thing worth doing when a man was carrying March in his chest every day. He noticed that too, she was certain. He had the observational habits of someone who had spent years reading weather and land and animals for information. But he didn't comment, and she didn't explain, and they continued their unspoken arrangement of acknowledging things without discussing them. What broke this pattern, unexpectedly, was a Wednesday afternoon in February. Henry came home from school alone. This was wrong in a specific way that Eliza registered immediately, because Henry never came home alone. Thomas always walked with him, which was an arrangement that had apparently been in place since Henry started school, and which neither boy had needed anyone to tell them to maintain. Henry came through the door with his red mittens and his school bag and a face so carefully neutral it was practically shouting. "Where's your brother?" Eliza said. "He's coming." "Henry." "He got kept after school." A pause. "By the teacher." "Why?" Henry set his bag down very slowly. "Because of Jimmy Calloway." She closed her eyes briefly. "What happened this time?" "Jimmy said—" Henry stopped, started again. "Jimmy said that Mama left because she wanted to, that she didn't have to die, that she just left because she didn't want to be here anymore." The kitchen was very quiet. Eliza had learned enough about Eleanor Hawthorne by now, through small fragments, through the way Silas's face went closed and careful whenever her name came up, through a photograph she'd noticed on the mantelpiece in the main room, to know that Eleanor had died of fever, suddenly, before Henry was old enough to form solid memories. It had not been a choice. It had simply been the terrible randomness of illness in a place 14 miles from the nearest doctor. And some boy named Jimmy Calloway had stood in a schoolyard and told Henry it was something else. "What did Thomas do?" she asked, though she already knew. "He hit him again," Henry said. "Harder this time." She nodded once. Thomas arrived home 40 minutes later, escorted by a man she'd not met before. Narrow-shouldered, self-important in the way of people who have small authority and use all of it, who introduced himself as Mr. Fletcher, the schoolteacher, and who informed Eliza at the door with considerable formality that Thomas Hawthorne had engaged in his second physical altercation in the space of 6 weeks, and that another incident of this nature would result in his removal from the school. Eliza looked at Thomas, who was standing slightly behind Mr. Fletcher with his eyes fixed on a point somewhere above and past everyone's head, and his jaw set in a way that looked so exactly like his father it almost knocked her sideways. "I understand," she said to Mr. Fletcher. "Thank you for bringing him home." "His father should be informed. His father will be informed," she said. Her tone was pleasant and left no room for further discussion. Mr. Fletcher appeared slightly startled by this. He looked at Eliza, then at Thomas, then back at Eliza, as if he'd expected more acknowledgement of his own importance in this situation. "Well," he said. "Good evening, then." "Good evening, Mr. Fletcher." She closed the door. Thomas was still looking at that point above everyone's head. "Inside," she said. He came in. He sat down at the kitchen table, not because she told him to, but because his legs appeared to have decided they were done for the moment. He put both hands flat on the table and stared at them. Eliza got him a glass of water and set it in front of him. She did not tell him Jimmy Calloway wasn't worth it. She did not tell him fighting never solved anything. She did not say any of the things that adults say because they run out of better options. She sat down across from him and waited. After a long moment, Thomas said, "He said she chose to leave." "I know. She didn't choose anything. She was sick. It wasn't... She didn't choose." "I know that. Then why does he get to say it?" Eliza was quiet for a moment. "He gets to say it because no one has stopped him yet. And the problem with hitting him is that it gives everyone something else to talk about. Now, instead of what he said, they're talking about what you did." Thomas's jaw tightened further. She could see him processing this, hating it, knowing it was true. "Your mother didn't leave," Eliza said. "Losing her wasn't fair. What that boy said wasn't fair. And being 11 years old and having to sit in a schoolyard and hear those words and not have a better answer than your fists, that isn't fair either." She paused. "But you're going to have to find a better answer. Not because fighting is wrong in some large, important sense. Because your father cannot afford for you to get removed from school, and because you are the kind of person who is eventually going to need people to take him seriously, and you can't build that on your knuckles." Thomas stared at his hands for a long time. "What's the better answer?" he finally asked. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "We'll figure it out." He looked up at her then, and something in his expression shifted. Not all the way to open, not all the way to trusting, but moved. Like a door that had been shut a long time and had just been eased off the latch. Not opened, but released. He drank the water. When Silas came in that evening, Eliza met him at the door before he could see Thomas's face, which still showed the edges of the afternoon, and told him quietly and plainly what had happened. She watched his expression move through several things in quick succession: anger, exhaustion, and then something underneath those, something tired and familiar that she recognized as the particular helplessness of a parent who doesn't know how to fix the unfixable thing. "I'll talk to him," Silas said. "He's had a long day. Maybe morning." Silas looked at her. There was something in his eyes that she'd been noticing more lately. This quality of attention he gave her when she said something that surprised him, which was apparently more often than he'd expected. "He was already fighting again," Silas said. "Not a question. Not exactly. The Calloway boy said something about his mother." Silas went very still. "What specifically?" She told him. She watched his face do something quiet and controlled and very painful. "I should have," he started. "There's nothing you should have done differently today," she said. "Tomorrow you can talk to him about how to handle it going forward. Tonight he's done." A long pause. "You're not wrong," he said finally, which she had come to understand was the closest Silas Hawthorne came to saying "you're right." He went inside. She heard him go upstairs and knock on Thomas's door, and this time the voices were different, still quiet, still too low for her to make out words, but the rhythm of them was different, longer, back and forth instead of one-directional. She stood in the kitchen and quietly made soup, and did not think about how it felt to be trusted with things that mattered. She mostly did not think about it. But it was there, the same way the warm kitchen was there before Silas came downstairs in the morning. Something you didn't announce. Something that had simply changed while no one was officially paying attention. The soup was ready when he came back down. She ladled it into bowls without being asked. He sat down and ate, and for the first time in nearly a month of dinners, the silence between them was a different kind of silence. Not the silence of two careful strangers maintaining professional distance. Something else. Something that made her pick up her own spoon and look at the wall opposite rather than at him, because some feelings were like those numbers in the ledger. Even when you weren't trying to look at them, they had a way of adding up on their own, and she wasn't sure she was ready yet to see what the total came to. It snowed hard again that night, the kind of snow that changes the shape of things. She lay in the small room off the kitchen, listening to it, and counted what she had: a warm room, a purpose, 3 people who were, slowly, incompletely, in the specific halting way of people who had been hurt before, beginning to let her matter to them. It wasn't everything. It wasn't what she'd planned for her life when she was young and her father was alive and the farm was still hers. But it was something, and some nights, something is exactly enough to hold on to. The snow that fell that night left the ranch looking like something that belonged to a different world entirely. Quieter, cleaner, the kind of white that makes you believe briefly that everything underneath it might also be new. Eliza knew better than to trust that feeling. New was a thing you built, not a thing that arrived with the weather. March came in cold and stayed that way. The land payment that Silas had been staring at in the ledger since January did not get smaller simply because February had passed. Eliza knew this without being told, the same way she knew when the flour barrel was running low without having to check. She'd developed a sense for the particular quality of tension that settled over the house when Silas was doing math in his head. He went quieter than usual. Not distant, exactly. Just compressed, like a man making himself smaller so the problem had more room. She had made her adjustments to the kitchen spending and kept quiet about them. But 3 weeks into March, she did something she had not fully planned to do, which was to sit down at the kitchen table on a Saturday afternoon while the boys were outside and put the household spending numbers on a sheet of paper and slide it across to Silas without preamble. He looked at the paper. He looked at her. "I reworked the food costs," she said. "We've been wasting about 30 cents a week on portions that don't get eaten and bread that goes stale. I fixed that. The number at the bottom is what we're actually spending now versus what you budgeted in January." He picked up the paper. He read it carefully, which she appreciated. Some men would have glanced at it and set it down as a formality. Silas read every line. "You've been doing this since February," he said. "Not a question. Since I saw the ledger," I wasn't snooping, she added, because it needed saying. I was cleaning the desk. He was quiet for a moment. I know. The difference isn't large enough to solve the March problem, she said, but it's enough to matter. Silas set the paper down and looked at the table for a moment in the way he did when he was deciding how much to say. She had learned to wait through these pauses rather than fill them. I put in on a second cutting of hay last fall, he said finally. Thought the prices would hold. They didn't hold. He exhaled slowly. The shortfall on the land payment is $340. It was a large number. She kept her face level. What are the options? Sell 2 of the breeding stock, take out a short note with the bank in town. He paused. Or ask my brother for a loan. The way he said my brother told her everything about which of these options was the most painful. There's a 4th option, she said. He waited. The Henderson farm, 4 miles west. I heard in town last week that they're looking for someone to do mending and alterations through the spring. Their daughter's getting married in May. That's a lot of work for a seamstress. She had not been planning to say this. It came out of its own momentum. I'm a capable seamstress. My mother taught me. I could take the work in the evenings after the boys are in bed, and on Sundays. Whatever I earn goes toward the shortfall. Silas stared at her. It's not enough on its own, she said, but combined with selling 1 animal instead of 2, it might be. You're offering to work a second job, he said slowly, in addition to the work you were hired to do. I'm offering to do what needs doing, she said, which is what I said I would do when I got here. He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, she could hear Henry shouting something at Thomas about the proper way to build a snow wall, which apparently was a matter of serious philosophical disagreement between them. I can't ask you to do that, Silas said. You didn't ask. I'm telling you. She stood up and collected the paper. I'll go to the Hendersons on Monday. I'll let you know what they offer. She went back to the stove before he could find an argument, because she had a feeling that given enough time, he would find a perfectly good one, and she didn't particularly want to hear it. She heard him pick up the paper again behind her. She heard the specific silence of a man sitting very still. Eliza, he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. She didn't turn around. The soup will be ready in 10 minutes, she said, which was not a response to anything he'd said, but gave both of them a moment to breathe. He didn't finish whatever he'd meant to say. She heard his chair push back and his boots cross the floor, and then the door opened and he went outside, probably to look at something that needed looking at, which was what he did when emotions threatened to become inconvenient. She stood at the stove and was very deliberate about stirring the soup. The Henderson arrangement came together on Monday as she'd expected. Martha Henderson was a practical woman with a daughter whose wedding plans had expanded significantly beyond the family's original estimates, and the relief on her face when Eliza displayed her needlework was almost comical. The rate was fair, the timeline was tight. Eliza came home that evening with a bundle of fabric and a list of alterations that would keep her busy through April. She said nothing about the rate to Silas, just set the fabric in her room and came out and made dinner. But that night, after the boys were in bed, she was sitting at the kitchen table with the wedding dress bodice in her lap, and her needle moving in the particular rhythmic way that her hands knew how to do, even when the rest of her was tired, and she looked up and found Silas in the doorway. He'd stopped there, coffee cup in hand, watching her work with that assessing expression of his. You do that well, he said. I've been doing it since I was 8. He came in and sat down at the table, not across from her, but at the adjacent corner, which was close enough to talk without being directly confrontational, which she had noticed was how Silas preferred to have conversations that mattered. My wife used to do that, he said. Sit up late with sewing. Eliza's hands kept moving. She said nothing, because she had learned that the best thing to do when Silas Hawthorne offered something about Eleanor was to make as little reaction as possible, the same way you hold very still when a wild thing comes near. She made all of Thomas's clothes until he was about 5, he said. He didn't know until he started school and realized other boys' mothers bought theirs from the store. He thought it meant something, that she'd made them. He paused. I think he still does. He does, Eliza said quietly. Silas looked at her. He told you that? Not in so many words. He looked at his coffee cup. He doesn't talk much. He talks, she said. He just needs a particular kind of room to do it in. What kind is that? She thought about the kitchen in the evenings, Thomas leaning in the doorway, talking to the side of her head. One where no one is waiting to respond, where the talking can just sit there without needing to go anywhere. Silas was quiet for a moment. I haven't been good at that. You've been keeping this place running, she said. That's also something. It shouldn't be an either or. No, she agreed. It shouldn't. He sat with that for a while. She kept sewing. The lamp between them made a warm pool of light on the table, and outside the night was the deep Montana quiet that had stopped feeling lonely to her sometime around the middle of February. The night Eleanor died, Silas said, and then stopped. She waited. The boys were asleep. I sat with her and then I came downstairs and I sat at this table. I didn't know what else to do. I just sat here until morning. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. I've been sitting at this table ever since, in one way or another. Eliza set her sewing down. She looked at him directly, which was not what she usually did during these conversations, but this felt like a moment that deserved directness. You're not sitting still anymore, she said. You're working. That's different. Is it? Sitting still is waiting for something to change. Working it's putting one thing after another because that's what there is to do. That's not the same as being stuck. He looked at her for a long moment. In the lamplight, with the exhaustion and the weight of March and 3 years of doing everything alone written plainly on his face, he looked like a man standing at the edge of something he hadn't decided yet whether to step back from or into. How do you do that? He said. Do what? Say the thing that's actually true instead of the thing that sounds better. She picked up her sewing again. Practice, she said, and not much left to lose by saying it. He almost smiled. She was getting better at reading those, the almost smiles, the way his expression would move toward something and then pull back like a man who'd forgotten he was allowed. He finished his coffee and stood up. I'm going to take the Donner mare to town Saturday, he said, which was the business way of saying he'd chosen to sell one animal instead of two, which meant her Henderson earnings were going to matter. I'll have a figure for you by end of next week, she said, meaning the sewing money. He nodded, paused at the doorway. The soup was good tonight, he said. It was such an ordinary thing to say after everything else that it almost made her laugh. I put extra pepper, she said. Henry asked me to. Henry asked you. He left a note on the counter, very formal, signed his full name. This time Silas did smile. It was brief and lopsided and changed his entire face, and she looked back down at her sewing before she could think too much about it. Good night, Eliza, he said. Good night, Silas. He left. She sat in the lamplight and put careful stitches into a stranger's wedding dress and listened to the house settle around her into sleep, and she did not think about the way he'd said her name the first time, which had been in the afternoon, and the way he'd said it just now, which had been different. She absolutely did not think about that. The following Saturday brought the trip to town, and with it, something she hadn't been prepared for. Silas took the boys with him, which he did occasionally, a reward of sorts, or maybe just a need to have them near. Eliza stayed to manage the household, which she preferred. The silence of the ranch without its people was a different kind of silence from the normal kind, expansive, like a room you could breathe in fully. She was in the middle of taking down the curtains in the main room to wash them when she heard hooves in the yard, too early for Silas's return. The woman who knocked at the door was about 50, solid and well-dressed in the way of someone who had come from money and maintained her relationship with it carefully. She introduced herself as Mrs. Clara Brent, and she said this in the tone of someone who expected the name to mean something. Eliza knew the name. She had heard it in town, in the dry goods store, in the particular murmuring way that people mention the name of someone they feel slightly complicated about. Clara Brent was a widow of comfortable means who had a ranch of her own 10 miles east, and who had, according to the woman at the dry goods counter, been calling on Silas Hawthorne since last autumn. Mr. Hawthorne isn't here, Eliza said. He's in town. I expect him back by afternoon. Mrs. Brent looked at her with an expression of careful, polished assessment. She looked at Eliza's washing bucket and the curtains over her arm and the plain working dress with flowers still on the sleeve from the morning's baking. You must be the new housekeeper, she said. I am. I'd heard. A brief, deliberate pause that packed in more than a pause usually held. May I wait inside? Eliza stepped back from the door. She was not going to be petty about it. This was not her house, and Clara Brent had not done anything specifically wrong. and being unwelcoming to a caller was not something Eliza had it in her to do, regardless of the little prickle of something she refused to name that had started up at the base of her spine. She brought tea because tea was the appropriate thing, and she went back to her washing because work was also appropriate and did not require her to sit in the main room making conversation. Mrs. Brent did not seem to want conversation either. She sat with her tea and looked around the room with the particular attention of a woman considering a property she might have an interest in, and when Eliza came through the main room to hang the curtains back in the window, she said without looking up from her cup, "You've done well with this house. It needed a woman's attention." "It needed cleaning," Eliza said pleasantly. "Most things do." Mrs. Brent's eyes moved to her. The assessment was sharper now, stripped of the initial social gloss. "How long have you been here?" "Since January. And before that?" "I managed my family's farm." "Alone?" "With my father, until he passed." Something shifted fractionally in Mrs. Brent's expression. Not sympathy, exactly. More like the recalibration of an estimate. "Mr. Hawthorne is a good man," she said, and the careful weight she put on good man told Eliza that this was not the beginning of a compliment, but the beginning of something with edges. "He is," Eliza agreed. "He has struggled since Eleanor's death. They all have." She set her teacup down with precise quietness. "He needs someone who understands this country, who has roots here, who can be a proper companion to a man like Silas, not just someone who manages the domestic arrangements." Eliza finished hanging the curtain. She straightened the hem where it had caught. "That's probably true," she said. She kept her voice entirely even. "He deserves better than a temporary situation," Mrs. Brent said. Her eyes were on Eliza's face now, reading it. "Someone who can offer him real partnership, a genuine home, not an employment contract." The thing Eliza had been refusing to name settled somewhere just below her breastbone with a weight that surprised her. She turned to face Mrs. Brent. "You're right," she said. "He deserves exactly that." She smiled because she was not going to give this woman the satisfaction of anything else, and she went back to the kitchen with her washing bucket and her curtains and her unnamed thing, and she stood at the kitchen sink and looked out the window at the flat white distance of the Montana afternoon and said very quietly to no one, "Don't." Just that. Don't. Because she knew her own situation. She knew what she was. She was the housekeeper who had nowhere left to go when January ran out of options. She was the woman who ate at the kitchen table after the family had been served, and who kept her earnings from the Henderson work in a separate small envelope because it was important, always important, to know what was yours and what wasn't. She was not Clara Brent, with property and roots and a history in this territory that went back decades. She picked up her sewing needle and went back to the wedding dress. She was still at the table when Silas came home. The boys ran in first, Henry with a peppermint stick and a story about a dog that had apparently done something extraordinary outside the hardware store. Thomas, with the contained but unmistakable excitement of someone who had spent money on something and was trying to seem unbothered about it. A book. She could see the shape of it under his coat. Silas came in last, carrying the supplies, and he stopped when he saw Eliza at the table. "Mrs. Brent was here," she said. Straightforward. No decoration. Something happened in his face, a complicated something that moved through several stages quickly. "I was in town," he said. "I told her. She waited." A pause. "I gave her tea." He set the supplies down slowly. "What did she say?" "That you're a good man who deserves proper roots and real partnership." She kept her eyes on the dress. Her needle kept moving. "She's not wrong about any of that." He stood very still. "Eliza." "Dinner will be ready at 6, she said. "I made the bean soup again. Henry requested it." "I didn't invite her here. That's not any of my business. I'm making it your business." His voice had an edge she hadn't heard before. Not anger at her, something else. Frustration turned inward, the voice of a man who has just discovered he's been failing to account for something important in his calculations. "She comes by sometimes. I haven't encouraged it." "You don't have to explain yourself to me," Eliza said. She sounded calmer than she felt. She was quite proud of that, actually. "I want to." She looked up at him then. He was standing in the middle of the kitchen with the particular look of a man who has said more than he meant to and is now doing the arithmetic on what that means. The boys were in the main room. She could hear Henry narrating something to Thomas about the extraordinary dog. "Thomas got a book?" she said. A long pause. "Jules Verne," he said. "He mentioned last month he'd read the first one." She had not known he'd noticed Thomas mention that. The information sat in her chest and did something she couldn't quite categorize. "That was a good thing to do," she said. He looked at her for another moment, and the quality of the look was the kind that needed answering, but neither of them had found the right language for yet. Then he picked up the supplies and put them away, one item at a time, with the methodical practicality of a man giving himself something to do with his hands. The soup was ready at 6. Everyone sat down. Henry ate enthusiastically. Thomas had the Jules Verne open beside his bowl, which was technically against the dinner table rules, but Silas didn't say anything about it, and Eliza decided she didn't need to either. Halfway through the meal, Silas reached across the table and straightened the book so Thomas could see it better without craning his neck. It was such a small thing, the kind of small thing that slips right past you if you're not paying attention. Eliza was paying attention. She looked at the four of them around the table. This man she hadn't known in January. These two boys who had been strangers and were not strangers anymore. This kitchen that had become the center of something she hadn't planned on. And she felt the unnamed thing settle more firmly in her chest, and she thought, this is the most dangerous kind of belonging, the kind that happens before you've decided to let it. She looked back at her soup. She thought about Clara Brent and the exact shape of the words, not just someone who manages the domestic arrangements. She thought about the envelope in her room with the Henderson money. She thought about a courthouse hallway in January and a coat 2 sizes too large and a lawyer who hadn't looked up from his papers. "Don't," she told herself again. But the kitchen was warm, and Henry was explaining something about dogs to his bowl of soup, and Silas was watching his sons with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Open, quiet, present in a way he hadn't been in February or even early March. And she knew, with the particular sinking certainty of someone who has already made a mistake they can't quite take back, that it was probably already too late for don't. The land payment got made. Eliza didn't ask how exactly, whether it was the mare sale and the Henderson money and one smaller note from the bank, or some combination she wasn't fully aware of. What she knew was that on the last Friday of March, Silas came home from town with the receipt folded in his breast pocket, and he sat down at the kitchen table and let out a breath that sounded like it had been held since January. She set a cup of coffee in front of him without comment. He looked at it, then at her. "Henderson work is done?" "Delivered the last of it Wednesday." Mrs. Henderson cried, which I think was about the daughter and not the alterations. Something in his expression moved toward that almost smile. "How much did you clear?" "Enough." She sat down across from him. "I'd like to give it to you, for the account." He shook his head immediately. "No." "Silas?" "No." His voice was firm, but not unkind. "You earned that doing work that was not part of what I hired you for. That money is yours." She looked at him steadily. "The ledger needed it." "The ledger will manage." He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "I mean it, Eliza. Keep it." She didn't argue further because she recognized the particular set of his jaw that meant the decision was made, and further conversation would just be noise. She kept the money. She added it carefully to the envelope in her room, which now had enough in it that it had stopped feeling like a crisis fund and started feeling like something slightly more dignified than that. Something like a future, maybe. The very early, uncertain edges of one. April came in warmer than expected, which was a mercy. The mud season that followed the snowmelt was its own kind of brutal. Everything that had seemed solid and manageable under the snow revealed itself as soft and uncertain underneath. But the days were longer and the light was different, and the ranch responded to warmth the way living things always do, which is to say, it started trying again. The boys spent more time outside, which meant they spent more time getting dirty, which meant more laundry, but Eliza had stopped mentally cataloging the inconveniences of this place sometime in March. It was just the work. The work was just what there was. Thomas had not gotten into another fight at school. This was partly, she suspected, because she had done something slightly conniving in February that she hadn't told anyone about. She had, on one of her early trips to town, made a point of introducing herself to the Calloway family. Not to complain, not to make any kind of formal point, but simply to be seen. to be known as a person connected to the Hawthorne household. She had been pleasant and straightforward in the way she'd learned to be pleasant and straightforward with people whose cooperation she needed, and she had mentioned, without any particular emphasis, that Thomas Hawthorne was a serious and talented student who would benefit from a more peaceful school environment. Mrs. Calloway had looked at her with the expression of a woman whose son had been coming home with bruises and who had been quietly hoping someone would handle this without official intervention. The Calloway boy had stopped saying things at school, apparently. She hadn't told Thomas. She hadn't told Silas. It had simply been a problem with a solution, and she had found the solution, and that was the end of it. What she hadn't accounted for was that Thomas, who was observant in the specific and slightly unnerving way of a child raised in a quiet house, would figure it out anyway. He came to her one Tuesday evening in April while she was transplanting some seedlings she'd been nursing in pots on the kitchen window sill. Small things, nothing ambitious, just herbs she thought might be useful. And he stood in his usual spot in the doorway and said without preamble, "You talk to the Calloway family." She kept her hands in the dirt. "Who told you that?" "Jimmy Calloway told me his mother said if he said one more word about my family, she was going to make him sleep in the barn." He paused. "His family doesn't have a barn." She almost laughed. She pressed it down. "And you think that had something to do with me?" "I think nobody else would have done that." She looked up at him. I was watching her with those careful eyes that had gotten slightly less careful over the past 3 months. Still watchful, but the specific wariness had softened around the edges. "Does it bother you," she asked, "that I did it without telling you?" He thought about this seriously, which was one of the things she had come to genuinely appreciate about Thomas Hawthorne. He didn't give quick answers to real questions. "No," he said finally. "I think if you'd told me I would have said not to, and that would have been stupid." "You might have had a point. You're the one who has to see him every day." "I also have to stop getting sent home by Mr. Fletcher." He looked at the seedlings. "What are those?" "Thyme, sage, and what I'm hoping is going to be parsley, but might be something else entirely." The seeds were old. He crouched down and looked at them with the same focused interest he gave most things when he thought no one was watching. "My mother grew mint," he said, "by the back step. It came back every year even when she didn't plant it again. It was still coming back the year after she died." Eliza was very still. "Did the mint come back this year?" she asked. Thomas looked up. Something crossed his face. Surprised, she thought, that she'd asked the right question rather than saying something soft and useless about his mother. "I don't know," he said. "I stopped looking." She nodded. She went back to the seedlings. "I could look," she said, "if you wanted to know." He stood up, dusted his hands on his pants, which immediately made them dirtier. "It's by the back step," he said, "on the east side." She checked the next morning. There it was, 3 small green shoots pushing up through the soil at the base of the back step, pale and tentative and very much alive. She didn't make an announcement of it. She simply said to Thomas at breakfast, without looking up from the stove, "It came back." He didn't respond, but he ate 2 extra pieces of bread at breakfast, which was his version of a visible emotion. Silas watched this exchange without participating in it, which was what Silas did. He observed the things that happened in his household with the focused attention of a man trying to understand a language he'd never been formally taught. He was, she had realized, someone who felt things deeply and had absolutely no reliable method for expressing that. He'd built his entire emotional life around utility. Useful things had worth. Useless things, sentiment, vulnerability, the acknowledgement of need, had no clear function he could defend, so he mostly didn't allow them. The problem with this, as Eliza understood it, was that it worked fine until something happened that was both important and completely useless in the practical sense. Something like gratitude, something like attachment, something like the specific feeling of watching a woman crouch over a pot of seedlings and know, without being told, what to ask about mint. She understood this because she had her own version of the same problem. The Friday that changed things, she almost missed entirely. It had been an ordinary Friday. She had done the washing, helped Henry practice his letters because he had a school examination. The following week, and his H's kept coming out backward, which she suspected was less about intelligence and more about the fact that he was left-handed, and no one had thought to account for that in how he was being taught. She had written down 4 things she wanted to say to Mr. Fletcher about this, and then thrown the paper away and then written 3 of the 4 things again because they still needed saying. Silas had gone to town for supplies. Alone this time, which happened when the purpose was business and efficiency rather than the boy's occasional reward. He was supposed to be back by afternoon. He came back earlier than expected, which was the first odd thing. She heard the wagon in the yard at 2:30, earlier by an hour than she'd anticipated, and she looked out the kitchen window and watched him climb down with the supply boxes and carry them into the barn in the efficient way he had of moving through physical tasks. When he came through the kitchen door, he was carrying something she hadn't put on any list. It was a chair. Plain wood, solid, ladder, the kind of basic functional chair that could be found in any dry goods store in the territory. He carried it in his right hand by the back rail, the way you carry a chair when you're moving it from one place to another and it hasn't yet been decided what it means. He set it down at the kitchen table. There was already a chair at every place that was used. Silas's chair, which was at the head. The boys' chairs, on either side. And then there was the chair at the opposite end from Silas, where Eliza sat, which she'd been using since her first week there. It had been against the wall originally, slightly separated from the other 3, and she had moved it into its position at the table without remark, and no one had remarked on it since. But now there was a 5th chair. Silas set it down at the table and stood back and looked at the arrangement for a moment with the expression of a man verifying that something is correctly placed. Then he went back outside to unload the rest of the supplies. Eliza stood at the kitchen counter and looked at the 5-chaired table. Henry came through a minute later and stopped. He counted the chairs with the frank mathematical interest of a 7-year-old encountering an addition. "There's a new chair," he said. "I see that." "Why?" She had no good answer for this that would be accurate and appropriate for a 7-year-old, so she said, "Ask your father." Henry thought about this. "Are we getting company?" "I don't think so." "Then why—" "Henry!" She found him something to do with his hands, which was usually the fastest way to redirect his attention. "Go see if the eggs need collecting." He went, satisfied enough. He was a child who could be distracted by purpose. Thomas came in 20 minutes later and also stopped, and also counted, and his reaction was more complicated than Henry's. He looked at the chairs, and then at the doorway where his father had gone, and then back at the chairs, and then at Eliza, and the look he gave her had too many layers in it for her to sort through quickly. She said nothing. He sat down in his own chair, not the new one, his own chair, and opened his Jules Verne and did not say anything either. That night at dinner, no one mentioned the chair. The 5 of them sat, because somehow, without discussion, Eliza occupied the new chair, and her old chair remained against the wall, and this transition happened as naturally as water finding a level. And Henry told a long story about a particularly uncooperative hen, and Thomas read 2 paragraphs of Jules Verne aloud at Henry's request, and Silas ate his dinner and occasionally corrected something in Henry's retelling of the hen story on factual grounds. Ordinary. Entirely ordinary. Except for the 5th chair, except for what it meant that there were now 5 chairs at the table of a house where 4 people lived. She washed the dishes that night and didn't say a word about it, and Silas came through to get his coffee and didn't say a word about it, and they existed for a full hour in the kitchen with the 5-chaired table between them and the unspoken things sitting in the room as solidly as the furniture. She was nearly done. She was thinking about bed. She was measuring the exact moment when she could reasonably say goodnight and go to her room and be alone with this feeling that needed somewhere private to be. When she heard the particular sound of Silas setting down his coffee cup with the deliberate care of a man who has decided something. "The Henderson work," he said. "Is that finished now?" "Yes, since last week." "Are you looking for more of that kind of thing?" She turned from the sink. "I wasn't planning on it. Why?" He was looking at the table, at the 5th chair. "Because if you were looking for other work, outside arrangements, I'd want to know." She understood what he was asking. He wasn't asking if she was going to leave. He was asking if she was thinking about leaving. And the fact that he was asking, that it mattered to him in a way that had found its way into words despite all of his habits against that kind of admission, landed somewhere in her chest with a weight that was not uncomfortable. "I'm not looking," she said. He nodded slowly. "Good." He looked at the table again. "The boys, they've been different this spring." "Better?" "Yeah." He picked up his coffee cup again. Henry laughs more. Thomas, he stopped. Thomas came and talked to me last week. On his own. About school. About the book. He paused. He hasn't done that in a long time. Eliza said nothing. She went back to drying her last dish. I know why, Silas said. I'm not unaware of what's happened in this house since January. She set the dish down carefully. You've been paying attention, she said. I've always paid attention. He stopped himself again. He did this when he hit the edge of what language would do for him, she'd noticed. He ran up against it and then stood there. I'm not good at saying things. You're better than you think. He looked at her. How would you know that? Because you bought a chair, she said, and you put it at the table. And that said more than most people manage in a full conversation. A long silence. The lamp made its small, warm circle on the table with the 5 chairs. Clara Brent is going to come back, he said. Not an announcement, more like something that needed to be in the open. I expect so. I'm going to tell her not to. She was very still. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. The echo of her own words from 3 months ago, when she'd said exactly that to him about the fence posts. She noticed it. She thought he noticed that she noticed. Eliza. He said her name the way he'd said it that first Saturday, like it was a sentence by itself. I need you to understand something. She waited. When I brought that chair home today, I didn't plan to. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. I went to get supplies. I walked past the store with the furniture in the window, and I stopped without knowing why I was stopping, and I went in, and I bought a chair, and I drove it home. He paused. And when I put it down at the table, I understood what I'd done, why I'd done it. He met her eyes. And I'm not going to pretend I don't understand it. The kitchen was very quiet. The house was settled into sleep around them, the boys upstairs, the lamp burning between them. I'm your housekeeper, she said. Not a rejection. More like the last careful check, the kind you do before you trust the weight to something that might break. You were my housekeeper, he said. I don't know what you are now, but it isn't that. Not only that. His jaw worked for a moment. I don't know how to say this well. You're saying it fine. I'm saying it badly. Silas. She waited until he looked at her. You're saying it. That's the part that matters. He put the coffee cup down. He looked at his hands for a moment, the calloused and rope-worn hands of a man who had spent 3 years doing everything alone, and then he looked at her. I don't want you to go, he said. It was simple. It was quiet. It was the most undefended thing she had ever heard him say. I know that's not enough, as statements go. I know there are things I haven't said and things I haven't figured out how to... Stop, she said gently. He stopped. I'm not going anywhere, she said. I told Thomas that in February and I meant it and I mean it now. She paused. I'm not the same woman who came up that road in January. I came here with nowhere left to go and $4.10 and a name on a scrap of paper. And somewhere between the blizzard and the fence posts and the bread and Henry's mittens, this place stopped being where I ended up and started being... She stopped herself. Started being what? He said very quietly. She looked at the 5th chair. Where I belong, she said. The silence after that was different from all the other silences. It had something in it. Some kind of warmth that had been in the room for a while now, probably, waiting for someone to finally acknowledge it existed. Silas reached across the table. He put his hand over hers. Once. Briefly. Then he pulled it back because he was still Silas and he was not going to suddenly become a different man, and she would not have wanted him to. I need to figure out how to say the rest of this, he said. I know, she said. I need some time. You have time. She stood up and picked up her sewing from the corner of the counter because the wedding dress was long finished, but she'd taken on a new commission, a christening gown for the Miller family, and work was still work. Silas, he looked up. The chair was enough, she said. For tonight. The chair was enough. She went to her room and shut the door and sat on the edge of her bed and looked at the christening gown in her hands, and did not try to stop the feeling that was moving through her. She let it come. She'd learned from her father that you couldn't save yourself from a flood by refusing to get wet. You just had to stand in it and find out how deep it went. It went deep. She sat with that for a while, and then she picked up her needle,
because the gown was not going to finish itself, and Mrs. Miller's baby was due in May, and because some things in life stay gloriously, reliably ordinary, regardless of what is happening in your chest. She was still sewing at midnight when she heard Silas's boots cross the main room to the stairs. She heard him pause at the bottom of the staircase for a moment. She didn't know why. She didn't hear him move. And then she heard him go up, slow and steady, and she heard his door close. She thought about the chair. She thought about, "I don't want you to go," said in the voice of a man for whom those words cost something real. She thought about the ranch in January, arriving in the gray afternoon with a wagon boy and a canvas bag, and how the house had looked dropped and forgotten in the landscape, and how inside it the silence had the quality of a space that had given up. And she thought about what this kitchen sounded like on a Tuesday evening when Henry was explaining something to his soup and Thomas was reluctantly admitting a joke was funny, and Silas was slowly learning to sit at a table like a man who had somewhere to be. The lamp burned. The needle moved. Outside, Montana did what Montana does in April, cold still but leaning, slowly, toward something else. She turned 40 stitches through linen and let herself carefully and without any fuss be happy. Just that. Just happy. In the specific, ordinary, very human way of someone who has found solid ground after a long time of not being certain the ground would hold. It wasn't everything yet, but it was the beginning of everything. And she knew the difference because she had been paying attention all along. The christening gown for the Miller baby was finished by the second week of April, folded carefully in brown paper and delivered on a Wednesday morning when the air smelled like mud and new grass and the specific clean sharpness of a season that has finally decided to commit. Mrs. Miller cried when she unfolded it. Eliza had added a small detail along the collar that hadn't been in the commission. A row of tiny stitched leaves, nothing elaborate. Just something that felt right for a child coming into the world in spring. Mrs. Miller touched the leaves with one finger and couldn't speak for a moment, and Eliza accepted this the way she accepted most emotional things that happened in her direction, which was quietly and without making a production of it. She drove back to the ranch in the borrowed wagon, thinking about the chair. She had been thinking about the chair on and off since Friday night. Not obsessively. She was not a woman given to obsession. But it was there, the way a stone is there at the bottom of a clear stream, visible through everything that moves above it, solid, not going anywhere. Silas had said he needed time to find the words. She had said he had time, she had meant it when she said it, and she meant it still. But time, it turned out, had its own ideas about how fast or slow it would move, and the days between Friday and Wednesday had moved with the specific irritating patience of something that knows you are waiting. He had not acted differently. That was what she noticed. Not in the way she might have feared. There was no new awkwardness, no careful avoidance, no morning after formality that would have told her they'd both made a mistake in allowing what was said to be said. He came down in the morning and she made coffee and they occupied the kitchen in the same way they always had, with the same functional choreography of two people who have learned each other's rhythms without formally discussing the learning. But there was something underneath the ordinary, a current of awareness that hadn't been there before, or that had been there but unnamed, and naming it, even partially, even incompletely, had changed the quality of everything. She noticed the exact moment he entered a room. She suspected he noticed the same about her. Neither of them remarked on this. Henry noticed nothing, because Henry was 7 and had just discovered that frogs had returned to the creek behind the barn, and this was understandably the dominant fact of his universe. Thomas noticed everything, because Thomas always noticed everything. And he had become, over 4 months, very good at watching Eliza and Silas in the same way he watched weather. Not to comment on it, just to know what was coming. He didn't say anything. Yet. What broke the waiting was not a conversation. It was a Sunday afternoon, clear and unusually warm for mid-April, and Eliza was on her knees in the kitchen garden that she had claimed as a project sometime in March. Not a grand undertaking, just the rectangular plot of turned soil behind the east wall, where Eleanor had apparently grown things once, according to the evidence of an old planting border that someone had built and no one had touched in 3 years. She had been working on it in spare hours when the light was good, turning the soil over, taking out the matted dead growth. The mint? She'd left strictly alone. She'd built a small border around it to keep it clear, which she thought Thomas had noticed but not mentioned.
She was on her third row of turned earth when she heard footsteps behind her and looked up, expecting Henry with another frog update. It was Silas. He stood at the edge of the garden plot with his coat off and his sleeves rolled to the elbow in the way he did when he was working, which meant he'd come from the barn, and he looked at what she'd done with the garden for a long moment. "You didn't have to do this," he said. "I know." She sat back on her heels and brushed the dirt from her hands. The soil was good under the dead growth. It would have been a waste not to. He looked at the mint border. "Thomas told me," he said. "Told you what?" "That you checked. That first morning. That you came out here and looked." He paused. "He told me it came back." She waited. Silas crouched down beside the mint border, one knee in the dirt without appearing to think about it, and looked at the 3 green shoots that were now 2 weeks on, rather more than 3, closer to a dozen, pushing up in a spreading cluster that was going to need managing by June. "Eleanor planted that the first year we were here," he said. "She said every house needed something that came back on its own, something that didn't need you to remember it every spring." Eliza looked at the mint. She thought about a woman she'd never met, young and deliberate, pressing roots into unfamiliar soil on a frontier property that must have felt impossibly far from anything she'd known. She thought about what it meant to plant something with the intention of not being the one who always had to tend it. An act of optimism so quiet it could look like gardening. "She sounds like she was a practical woman," Eliza said. She was. Silas touched one of the mint leaves with one finger, the same careful way Mrs. Miller had touched the stitched leaves on the christening gown. "She would have liked you," he said. Not as flattery, as a plain statement of fact, which was how Silas said things when they mattered most. Eliza felt the words land somewhere deep and stayed very still for a moment. "I would have liked her," she said, and meant it. He stood up. He looked at the turned rows of soil. "What are you putting in?" "Beans along the south side because they want the sun, some squash. I found seeds in the back of the kitchen shelf that I think are tomatoes. They're old, but I'm going to try." She paused. "And I was going to ask you about a small section for cutting flowers. For the table. Nothing large. Just something." He considered this in the serious way he considered most things. "East corner," he said, "gets good afternoon light." "That's what I thought, too." He looked at her then, with the specific quality of attention he'd been giving her since Friday, and she met his eyes without looking away because, whatever they were navigating, she was done pretending she wasn't in the middle of it. "I've been thinking," he said. "I know. I have a way of thinking about something for a long time before I know what to do with it." He said this without apology, but with the self-awareness of a man who had learned, somewhat late, what his own habits cost him. It's not hesitation about you, or about what I said Friday. I need you to understand that. I do understand that. I've been trying to figure out how to ask something correctly, and I've realized that I've been waiting to figure it out completely before I say anything, which is, he stopped, which is what I always do, wait until I have the whole thing worked out. And Eleanor used to say that I spent so much time making sure the fence was perfect before I put the cattle in, that sometimes the cattle were halfway across the county. A sound came out of her that was halfway between a laugh and something that needed to be a laugh in order not to be something else. She wasn't wrong. "No," he said, "she usually wasn't." He looked at the garden. "I don't have this perfectly worked out. I don't know that I'm going to, so I'm going to say it before I talk myself into waiting longer." He looked at her directly. "I want to ask you to stay. Not as a housekeeper. Not under the current arrangement. I want to ask you to consider becoming part of this family. Properly. Permanently." He paused, and the pause was the honest kind, not theatrical. "I'm asking if you'd marry me. And I recognize that I'm asking it in a garden with dirt on my knee and no prior. I recognize this is not the way you're supposed to ask." Eliza was quiet for a moment. "Silas," she said, "I know it's—" "Let me finish." She stood up, which brought her close enough that she had to look up slightly to meet his eyes. "I came to this ranch in January with nothing, less than nothing. I had a loss and a name on a scrap of paper and about enough money to make it through a week. And I told myself that I wasn't going to pick up any feelings I couldn't afford to carry, because I'd learned by then that feelings cost more than they look like they will." She stopped.
I failed at that almost immediately. And I've been arguing with myself about it for 3 months, and Clara Brent coming to this house was the closest I came to an honest reckoning with what I'd let happen, because she stood in the main room and said what I already knew, that I was the housekeeper. That was what I was. That was the arrangement. She paused. And then you put a chair at the table, and the argument with myself got a lot harder. He was very still. Yes, she said. He blinked. Yes. Yes, I'll marry you. She glanced down at her own dirt-covered hands and then at his dirt-covered knee, and a real laugh came out of her this time, full and unplanned and entirely without self-consciousness. In the garden, both of us covered in soil. I think that's probably the most honest way it could have happened. Something broke open in his face. Not theatrically. Silas Hawthorne was never going to be theatrical. But the expression he wore in that moment, in the middle of Eleanor's mint and 3 years of struggling and 4 months of 2 careful people circling the truth, was the most unguarded she had ever seen him. It was the face underneath all the other faces. The one that had been waiting, she suspected, for something to make it safe to come out. He took her hand. He held it the same way he'd held it briefly in the kitchen on Friday. Firm, real, not tentative, except this time he didn't pull back. I need to tell the boys, he said. You should probably clean your knee first. He looked down, looked at the mud, looked back at her. Right. They went inside and the house received them the way it always did, which was to say it was simply there, warm and imperfect and theirs. The telling of the boys happened at dinner, which was not planned, but also, Eliza thought later, was inevitable. Plans in the Hawthorne household had a way of being adjusted by circumstance, which was probably the right training for a life on the frontier. Henry was in the middle of a very detailed account of a frog he'd named Gerald when Silas said, with the abruptness of a man who had decided the moment was now and was not going to let it pass, I asked Eliza to marry me today. She said yes. Henry stopped mid-sentence with his mouth still open. Thomas looked up from his plate with the expression of someone who had been waiting for a specific weather system to arrive and was now observing that it had. Henry's mouth closed, then opened again. You did? He looked at Eliza with the wide, calculating eyes of a child running quick mathematics. So you'd stay here? You'd stay always? That's the idea, she said. Henry turned back to his father. He pointed at Eliza with his fork in a manner that was not polite, but was entirely Henry. She makes the bread the right way, he said, as if this settled all further questions. Thomas said nothing. He looked at his plate for a moment, and Eliza watched his jaw do the same set thing it always did when he was working through something real, and she waited, because she'd learned that the only right thing to do with Thomas Hawthorne was to wait. He looked up. He looked at her, not at his father. You're sure, he said. Yes, she said. Because we're... He stopped. Tried again, with the labored honesty of a boy who had sworn off comfortable lies somewhere around the 2nd week of February. We're not easy, the 3 of us. We're not a... Thomas. He stopped. I know what you are, she said. I've been here since January. I know about the fence posts and the ledger and the bread and the mittens and the mint and Gerald the frog. She held his gaze. I know what I'm signing on to. I'm signing on to it anyway. A long pause. Okay, Thomas said. He picked up his fork and went back to eating, which was his version of acceptance, and Eliza understood it completely. Henry asked 6 more questions over the course of dinner, most of them practical. Would she still sleep in the small room, or would she sleep upstairs? Could she still make the bean soup on Tuesdays? Was Gerald allowed to come inside if he was in a jar with holes in the lid? She answered each one in order. Thomas contributed 2 additional questions, both very quiet, both more important than they appeared on the surface. Would she keep her own name or take Hawthorne, and would she have to go back to wherever she came from first before she could stay permanently? Eliza said she would take Hawthorne if Silas and the boys were agreeable, which produced a silence from Silas that was the specific silence of a man unexpectedly moved, and she said no, she had nothing to go back for. She was already where she was supposed to be. Thomas nodded once at this, with the gravity of someone filing a piece of information in the correct place for future reference. Henry asked one more question after dinner, standing in the kitchen while she was washing up, his red mittens still on his hands because the evening had turned cool and he'd just been outside. Eliza. Hmm. When you were sad before, when you came here, are you still sad? She turned from the sink and looked at him. 7 years old, mittens on in April, completely serious. Not the same way, she said honestly. Some sadness doesn't go away, but it changes shape, and other things grow up around it. She nodded at the window where the kitchen garden was just visible in the last light. Like the mint. Henry considered this with great seriousness. Gerald comes back every spring too, he offered. Or a frog that looks like him. I think it's the same one. I think you might be right, she said. He went upstairs satisfied. She stood at the sink and let the warm water run over her hands and let herself feel the full ordinary weight of the evening. The proposal in the dirt, the dinner, the questions, the boy with the mittens. And she thought, this is what I will remember. Not a grand moment, these ones. The wedding was set for the second Saturday of May, which gave them 3 weeks and was partly practical. The spring work didn't pause for ceremony, and partly because Eliza had no interest in a long engagement. She was not a woman who needed time to prepare herself for things she'd already decided. The deciding was the slow part. Everything after was just doing. Clara Brent heard the news before the week was out, because news in a small frontier community travels the way weather does, without permission ahead of you. Eliza heard that she heard it through Martha Henderson, who had developed a fondness for Eliza during the christening commission, and who reported with the particular relish of a woman who has useful information that Mrs. Brent had received the news with considerable stillness, and then said, very precisely, that she wished Mr. Hawthorne well. Eliza thought about Clara Brent sitting in that main room with her tea and her careful words, not just someone who manages the domestic arrangements, and she felt, unexpectedly, something she had not expected to feel, which was a kind of sympathy. Clara Brent was a woman of 50, who had been a widow longer than she'd wanted, and who had made her interest in a decent man as clear as she was capable of making it, and had lost out to a woman with no roots and a canvas bag who had arrived in January out of nowhere and simply stayed. There was nothing villainous in any of that. It was just the arithmetic of wanting things that didn't work out, which was not a story exclusive to anyone. She hoped Clara Brent found her version of a fifth chair eventually. She meant that sincerely. The week before the wedding brought a problem, as weeks before significant events tend to do when they want to be honest about the nature of life. The problem arrived in the form of a letter, delivered by the mail rider on a Tuesday, addressed to Silas in handwriting Eliza didn't recognize. She set it on the table without looking at it further, and when Silas read it that evening, his expression went through 3 things in quick succession that she had learned to read as the particular sequence of a Hawthorne man receiving bad news. The stillness first, then the jaw, then the very deliberate setting down of the paper. "What is it?" she said. "My brother." He looked at the letter again, as if hoping it had changed. "He's coming." She waited. "He's coming for the wedding, which is—" He stopped. "Which I expected. But he's coming early. He'll be here Thursday." She understood from his tone that this was not uncomplicated news. "You haven't told me much about your brother," she said. "No." He folded the letter. Robert is not a bad man. He's my brother. I love him." He said this with the deliberate precision of someone making sure the baseline is established before the complications. He has opinions about how things should be done, about how I've managed things since Eleanor. He paused. "He's the one I almost had to borrow from in March. He would have lent it, and he would have said nothing about it directly, ever, and I would have known he was thinking it every time I saw him for the next 10 years. Eliza absorbed this. "And now he's coming to meet the woman you've asked to marry you after 4 months." "Yes." "And he has opinions." "He will have opinions," Silas said. "He won't have expressed them yet. He'll express them here." She looked at the folded letter on the table. "Well," she said. "Good. I'd rather know what we're dealing with than find out at the wedding." Silas looked at her with that expression, the recalibrating one, the one that had started in January and still hadn't entirely finished. "You're not worried?" "I'm a little worried," she said honestly, "but I'm not going to rearrange my face about it until I've actually met him." Robert Hawthorne arrived on Thursday afternoon on a roan horse that was better quality than most of the horses in the county, which told her something immediately. He was 3 years younger than Silas,
broader through the shoulders, with the same dark coloring but a manner that was entirely different. Where Silas was contained and deliberate, Robert was expansive. He came through the yard with the confidence of a man accustomed to being the most comfortable person in any room, and he shook Silas's hand with the particular warmth of brothers who have a complicated history and have decided, mostly, to be on each other's side. He turned to Eliza. He looked at her the way she imagined assessors look at property. Not disrespectfully, just systematically. She let him look. "Miss Rowan," he said. "Eliza," she said. "You might as well start with that." Something in his expression shifted. Slight surprise, quickly covered. He had expected, she suspected, someone either softer or more aggressive. She was neither, which was apparently not what the models had predicted. "Eliza," he said. "Robert." Henry appeared at her elbow at this point, because Henry had no instinct for adult tension and found new people interesting in the straightforward way of a child who has not yet learned to be strategic. "Are you Uncle Robert?" he demanded. "Dad said you were coming. Gerald came back. I think it's the same one from last year." Robert looked down at Henry with an expression that softened immediately and genuinely. "Who's Gerald?" "A frog. Do you want to see him? He's in a jar." "Maybe after supper," Eliza said, and put a hand briefly on Henry's shoulder in the way she'd developed of redirecting him without making it feel like redirection. "Why don't you go tell Thomas his uncle's here?" Henry went at speed. Robert watched him go, and when he turned back his expression was different, still assessing but warmer around the edges. "He seems healthy," he said, and the way he said it made her think that this was not the uncomplicated observation it appeared to be. Like he'd been worried about something and was relieved not to find it. "He's very healthy," she said. "Come inside. Dinner's at 6. Supper that first evening was a study in managed tensions, and Henry's complete obliviousness to them, which was, she decided, a genuine mercy. Henry talked enough for 3 people, and his stories were sufficiently detailed and peculiar that Robert could not help but engage with them, which broke the surface of the meal into something that functioned as normal family dinner even when it wasn't entirely. Thomas was quieter than usual. She noticed him watching Robert the way he watched people he hadn't decided about yet, with that flat, patient attention that could look like disinterest and wasn't. Silas said less than usual, which was quite a feat, and she could feel him monitoring the table the way you monitor a fire you're not certain you have quite managed. After dinner, when the boys were upstairs and Silas had gone to see to something in the barn, with the barely concealed relief of a man given a legitimate excuse to step away from a complicated room, Robert sat at the kitchen table with a second cup of coffee and said, without any particular preamble, "You've been here 4 months." "Since January," she said. She was washing the dinner dishes. She did not stop. "That's a fast decision for both of you." "It is." "Silas doesn't make fast decisions." "No," she agreed. "He doesn't. So you might want to think about what it means that he made this one." A pause. She heard him set down the coffee cup. "I'm not trying to be difficult." "I know." She turned and leaned against the counter and looked at him directly, because Robert Hawthorne was not a man you were going to manage by talking to the side of his head the way you could with his brother. "You're trying to protect him, and the boys. I understand that." She paused. "Let me tell you what I know. I know this ranch and what it costs to run it, and where the ledger was in January and where it is now. I know that Thomas talks when he's given the right kind of room to do it, and that he's been talking to his father more in the past month than probably the whole year before. I know that Henry has an unorthodox relationship with amphibians and needs someone to remember which mitten goes on which hand. I know that Eleanor planted mint at the back step, and that it comes back every spring and that it matters." She stopped. "I'm not saying I'm the only person who could know those things. I'm not saying I'm perfect at any of this. I've made bad bread and wrong guesses, and I said the wrong thing to Thomas in early February, and it took me a week to fix it. But I'm saying I know what I'm choosing and why, and I'm saying that I'm not going anywhere." She met his eyes. "Is there something specific you'd like to ask me?" Robert was quiet for a long moment. "My sister-in-law," he said finally, with a very careful kind of emphasis on the first word, as if he was trying it out. "What did my father do for work?" It took her a half-second to catch the pivot. "Farmer. Eastern Montana. Grain and some cattle." She paused. "He died in November. The bank took the property in January. That's what brought me here." "You have nothing left back there?" "Nothing." "So this isn't He stopped, chose the next words with more care. I want to make sure this isn't about needing somewhere to land. It was a fair question. She gave it the honest answer it deserved. It started that way, she said. I won't pretend otherwise. I came here because I needed work and there was work here. But that was January. She looked at the table, at the 5 chairs which she saw Robert notice and file away. You don't fall into the particular shape of a family by accident. You don't learn the way someone takes his coffee, and which questions to ask his son in which order, and what the mint at the back step means to the people in this house. You don't do all of that because you needed somewhere to land. You do that because it matters to you, because they matter to you. She turned back to the dishes. The water had gone cool. She didn't care. He hasn't laughed in 3 years, Robert said behind her. Quiet now. The business edge completely gone. My brother, since Eleanor, he stopped. Tonight at dinner, he almost laughed twice. I was counting. She kept washing. Almost, she said. He doesn't do almost. For 3 years, he doesn't do almost. A pause. He bought a chair. She turned. Robert was looking at the table with the expression of a man who understands what he's looking at. He told you, she said. He told me on the way in from the barn. He said he bought a chair and put it at the table and that it had said everything he didn't know how to say out loud. Robert looked at her. That's the most Silas thing I've ever heard in my life. He's incapable of a normal declaration, but he'll drive 14 miles for furniture. This time she did laugh. It came out without permission, and she didn't try to stop it. Robert smiled for the first time, really smiled, not the assessing version. He looked like Silas when he did it, around the eyes. I just needed to meet you, he said. I'm sorry for the interrogation. You weren't wrong to do it. No, he said, but I think I've got my answer. He picked up his coffee. Welcome to what's left of the Hawthorne family, Eliza. We're not easy either. I've heard that before, she said. I'm not particularly easy myself. We'll manage. He raised his cup. She raised her dishcloth because it was what she had, and they acknowledged each other with the specific warmth of 2 people who have had a real conversation and come out the other side of it with something intact. Silas came back in 10 minutes later, looked at the 2 of them, and read the room in the way he always did. Quick, accurate, unspoken. He looked at Eliza. She gave him the slight nod that meant it's fine. The tension went out of his shoulders in a way she felt across the room. There's coffee left, she said. Good, he said, and sat down with his brother, and the kitchen held all 3 of them the way it had been holding everyone who came through its door. Imperfectly, warmly, with room to spare. The wedding happened on a Saturday that couldn't have been scripted if someone had tried. The morning was overcast, which she had expected. May in Montana was not reliable, and she had decided months ago she didn't care. The ceremony was held in the front room of the ranch house, conducted by a justice of the peace named Harold Finch, who was 70 years old and had a beard that Henry found fascinating and could not stop looking at. There were 9 people in the room. Robert, the Henderson family, Martha and her husband, and the daughter whose wedding dress Eliza had altered. 2 neighboring families who had become, over the course of spring, something approaching regular visitors. Thomas and Henry. Thomas wore his good shirt and his hair combed flat in a way that suggested considerable effort and a mirror. Henry wore his red mittens because it was still cool in the morning and because he wanted to and because nobody said he couldn't. Eliza wore a dress she had made herself over the course of 3 weeks in the evenings, dark blue wool with a collar. She had spent more time on than anything else because collars were the thing that showed you'd paid attention. She had no flowers because the kitchen garden wasn't producing yet. So Henry had picked something from the field, a handful of small yellow wildflowers that were probably weeds and were exactly right. She stood next to Silas and felt the weight of the room around her. 9 people and 2 boys and a 70-year-old man with a remarkable beard, and thought about a courthouse hallway in January and a coat that didn't fit and a lawyer who hadn't looked up. She thought about the distance between that moment and this one. It was not a straight line. It was not a clean story. It was 4 months of getting up before dawn and making bread and mending mittens and holding fence posts in blizzards and sitting up late with other people's wedding dresses and having conversations in the dark about things that couldn't be said in daylight. It was bad bread and backward H's and a boy who cried into a desk in a schoolyard and a man who drove 14 miles and came back with a chair. Harold Finch said the words. Silas said yes. She said yes. When it was done, Henry said, Can Gerald come in now? And the room laughed, and Eliza held Silas's hand and thought that this was precisely what it was supposed to feel like. Not perfect, not cinematic, real. At the dinner after, which Eliza had cooked the day before, and Robert had helped with in the morning with the particular competent pragmatism of a man who'd fended for himself and wasn't precious about it, Thomas came and stood beside her while she was filling glasses. He stood there in his good shirt with his hair still mostly flat and didn't say anything for a moment. Then, I told Henry that if he calls you Mom, you'd probably be okay with it. She set down the pitcher she was holding. Did you? She said. He asked me if he was allowed to. Thomas looked at the table, at the 5 chairs, at the room full of people. I said I thought so, that you probably wouldn't mind. He paused. I said I might do it too, eventually. He stopped. When it felt right. She looked at him. 11 years old, careful and unfinished in the specific way of a person who is going to become someone very considerable once he gets all the pieces sorted. Eleanor's jaw. Silas's eyes. His own everything else. That would be fine, she said. Her voice was level. She was working to keep it that way. Whenever it feels right. For either of you. There's no deadline. He nodded once in the way he had. Filing it, confirmed. Good soup today, he said. Thank you, Thomas. He went back to the table, picked up his Jules Verne from under his chair where he'd hidden it earlier, and put it back down immediately because Robert said something at that moment that made him forget about it entirely. She picked up the pitcher and finished filling glasses and did not cry, because there was a room full of people and because she'd decided to be happy instead, which was a decision she was becoming more practiced at. Years do not move in scenes the way a single day does. They move in textures, in the accumulation of small things that don't seem like much on their own and become everything only when you look back. The Hawthorne Ranch in the years that followed was not a fairy tale. The cattle prices went sideways again in 1889. And there were 6 weeks that winter where the tension in the house was a living thing that sat at the table with them. Silas had a stubborn streak that his wife had a matching stubborn streak for, and they had, on at least 4 memorable occasions, not spoken to each other about something important for longer than was useful, and had then worked it out with the specific, ungraceful honesty of 2 people who have decided that resolution matters more than pride. She burned a month's worth of soap in 1890 and did not speak about it for 2 days, which Silas noticed and did not press, because he had learned by then exactly where her edges were. Thomas left for school in the fall of 1891, heading east with a letter of recommendation from a teacher who had, somewhere between the Jimmy Calloway incident and the Jules Verne phase, realized he had a genuinely exceptional student on his hands. He came back for summers, and he came back changed each time, a little more himself and a little less the boy who had needed to talk to the side of someone's head. He called her Mom for the first time the summer he was 15, said it on a Tuesday like it was ordinary, which it was by then, which was exactly right. Henry grew up outdoors and loud and interested in everything, which was no surprise to anyone who knew him at 7. He brought things home, animals, ideas, questions, once an entire abandoned beehive that he thought could be rehabilitated, which it could not, but the attempt was instructive. He called her Mom from the beginning because he was Henry, and he had made his decision before Thomas gave him the formal clearance and was simply waiting for the timing to feel natural, and the timing had felt natural about a week after the wedding. The kitchen table gained chairs. This was the detail that people in town eventually remembered, if they remembered the Hawthornes at all, that the table had kept acquiring chairs. First 5, then 6, when Robert started visiting regularly enough that a chair felt right. Then 7, then 8. Not all at once. Over years, as the shape of the family shifted and expanded in the particular organic way of things that are alive and choosing. The 5th chair, Eliza's chair, the plain ladderback that Silas had carried in from the wagon on an ordinary Friday in April, stayed where it had always been. It got worn smooth at the arms from use, and the legs got uneven at some point in the late 1890s, and Silas shimmied it with a piece of leather rather than replace it, which it probably needed to be, which she didn't mention, which he knew. Eleanor's mint came back every spring. Eliza tended it the way Eleanor had, without fuss, just making sure it had room, just keeping other things from growing over it. She thought of Eleanor when she did it, Not with the complicated feeling she might have expected, but with something quieter, more like gratitude. Eleanor had planted something intended to outlast her. It had. That was an act of faith in the specific wordless kind that doesn't require anything to believe in except the returning spring and the ground that holds things over winter. There were hard years and easier years, and one year that was nearly unbearable, when Silas was sick for 6 weeks with a fever that made Eliza understand, in the particular visceral way of someone sitting up at night listening to someone else breathe, exactly how much of her life had organized itself around this man. He recovered because he was Silas and he was constitutionally disinclined to do otherwise, and he told her afterward that he had not been worried about himself. He had been worried about her, sitting in that chair by the bed, not sleeping. She had told him that was the most ridiculous thing she'd ever heard. He had said he knew. They had stayed like that, her hand on his eyes finally clear, the window showing the first actual light of an early morning, for a long time without speaking, which was, she had long ago understood, the Hawthorne version of saying everything. She was 41 years old by then. She had been Eliza Hawthorne for 12 years. She still kept accounts. She thought sometimes about the woman in the courthouse hallway, the woman in the coat that didn't fit, holding papers that had turned her life into arithmetic. She thought about Gerald Pruitt and his bored face and his advice to look into domestic work. She didn't think of him with bitterness. She thought of him the way you think of weather that drove you somewhere you needed to go. It wasn't that he'd been right. It was that the worst moment she could remember had been the door to the best thing she had found. That was the thing about starting over that she hadn't known in January, standing in the cold. Starting over wasn't a failure of the first attempt. It was just the beginning of the story you were actually supposed to be living, dressed up as an ending so you wouldn't see it coming. You couldn't plan for it. You couldn't force it. All you could do was say yes when someone put a scrap of paper in your hand with a name on it, and hire the boy with the wagon and show up and stay. All you could do was stay. The kitchen table in the Hawthorne house seated 10 by 1895, and every chair was full on a Sunday, and Eliza stood at the stove and listened to the noise of it. All those voices, all that ordinary, complicated living. And she thought, this is what I chose, every single day, and I would choose it again. Not because it was easy, not because it was what she had planned, because it was real, and it was hers. And some things in this world you do not find by looking for them, but by being in the right place long enough to let them find you. The mint came back that spring, as it always did. She left it room.